Good afternoon. Do you mind coming on to the front? My name is Mohammed. I'm the Secretary of Business for the group. Just say, I'm going to invite Malcolm to do the housekeeping first. Malcolm from the slide.
Okay, thanks for having me. I'm Malcolm Barhampton, and I work here in the History Library and Archives. And we're very pleased to be able to host this afternoon on the behalf of the Bengal History Week. Just a couple of things. There's a fire, there's no fire drill expected, so if the alarm goes off, quite loud alarm. Our main means of exit is back through the main entrance where we came. If for any reason we can't get through that way, fire's there, you'll be led into the gents' toilet. I do assure you, there is an exit on the side of the gents' toilet. It leads down into the grounds of Queen Mary University. So anyway, there are toilets there. There's also an attachable toilet in the entrance lobby. So I'll hand back over to Helen. Thank you.
You're welcome. We're really pleased to have Nico speaking here today. We will give details about, I think we already circulated in the sharing that you can read up later on. I'm just going to say a little bit about the research and Bengal history week, and I'm passing to the for today's talk. Now, Women's Circle, we started formally in 2007, and the idea is that a lot of us used to talk politics, to sit in a cafe in the area, but we really didn't have good understanding knowledge about Bangladesh. But we kept on talking about politics, about various issues. And then we said, why don't we, change and try and learn something? Then our discussion will be better informed and based on more knowledge and understanding and facts. So we volunteered to do 1 month research on our campaign presentation. We did that for a while. Then we got bored. And then we started to invite speakers from outside. And nothing lasts forever, so slowly that went. But in 2007, we decided to formally, launch this organization. And since then, we've been having regular yearly events. We have a website, circle.org. And the idea is to we live in this country, this global life, but we want to get the organization to develop intellectually so that they can engage with the rest of the world on an equal footing and then we want to be equal in the future. Now, in terms of Bengal history, in 2007, was 250th anniversary of Bengal Cluster. So we ran some events, and then we got funding from Heritage Rotary to get young people to write a book, and Nick helped us in that project as well. There were 8 people, young people, worked with us, and they wrote a book. And then we launched it at the museum documents. And one of the girls who was involved in the project, who wrote a chapter, she was early 20s, and she suggested why not we organize an annual event like Bengal History Week or something, because they enjoyed and they learned so much. So they think this process should continue, the learning process. So we started in 2010 with the first Bengal History Week. And we decided to hold it during Black History Month. It can be a contribution to Black History Month as well. And this is the 5th one. So I won't say anymore. I'm going to pass on to Nick. He's going to write the subject is the East India Company, commodities, conquest, options.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for coming on Saturday afternoon and coming watching the TV, I suppose. But anyway, I've got 4 big C words on that front page there. I want to just like to take you through some pictures telling the story of the East India Company, an extraordinary institution which was born here in London on New Year's Day, 1600, and obviously had a huge impact, such as on Bengal, on world history. And This was a result of a book I wrote called The Corporation That Changed the World, which is a very bombastic title, but I hope to show through the book why this particular institution can be said to be changing the course of world history. This is the company's crest, and I think this year we've been thinking a lot about anniversaries. Many people are thinking about anniversary of what's called the First World War, 1914. Some the anniversary of the beginning of the Hanoverian reign of rulers of England, German kings. But it's also a very relevant anniversary for us, because in 1614, I think it was the time when the first Bengali arrived in London. And this person was later christened as Petrus Papa. He probably started as a Muslim. Christened as Petrus Papa, which means Peter Pope, by the Archbishop of Canterbury, as the church of St. Giles Back Church in Fenchurch Street in the heart of the city, and about 10 yards from the East India Company's headquarters. So this Bengali, this young Bengali man, had come over not as a representative of a Mughal trade mission or from a Mughal merchant ship, but on returning a ship from the East India Company. And he, from his own free will, came here, learned English, was christened, given his new name, Peter Pope, went back to Bengal, and things over. And I just want to give you a tale of this extraordinary company which brought this young man over. And through the three windows of commodities or commerce, that's what the company was set up to, it was set up to trade. Through conquest, it had its own private army and used that to gain control of parts of India. And then through corruption, which is another of its mechanisms it's used to gain power. So this really, I think, for us illustrates the first of these, commerce. This is a picture, this is probably life-size actually, which was put as a picture above on the ceiling of the company's revenue room, like its boardroom at its headquarters in Leonard Street in the city. I don't know if you know the Lloyd's building in the city. This was on the site there. And this is from 1778. I think this is a piece of, it's not very good art, it's been a corporate art by the East India Company to show really the world they operated in. So on the west you have Britannia here, on the left, with strings of pearls, lots of lovely Bengali muslin, covered in Bengali muslin, with a vast of Romney line and Old Father Thames here, and then on this side you have this extraordinary caravan of people from the east. You have Mercury, the classical god of commerce, bringing the camels, a Hindu man here, Indian lady, Chinese, tea, porcelain, jewels. This is the company's world of commerce. In the middle is its technology, the ship, the East India man ship. This was its key piece of technology. Like technology we talk about so much today, this was what made the difference for the company. This was what enabled it to get ship bullion across from London to Asia to bring back all these luxury goods. Now, the definition is not very good, but the company's flag, the fluttering on the flag there, was a St. George's cross on white background with red stripes. And it is supposed to be the basis of the stars and stripes of the United States. So this is how a company saw itself. This was its world of commerce. Let's look at commerce. This is Robert Klein on the left there, meeting Mir Jafar. Who's going to tell me who's Mir Jafar is, please? So, please.
Finally, the place
That's right.
aligned with climate
Yep.
and sort of people. So to be able to be agents of sort of
Yes, the general solution. That's right. Yeah, exactly. So here is Robert Klein and Mir Jafar meeting after the Battle of Plassey, which many of us will have heard about. This battle which was started the British Empire in India in 1757. And also what's interesting about that is that it's actually just a battle fought by a company. It was fought by the East India Company with its troops led by Clive, fighting the local prince, the Bengali prince, to recapture its base in Calcutta and to regain its commercial position with its private army. And it did this through primary growth. It was not army. The first person in line was Major Bug, who was general. And the second was a local merchant called Amir Khan, who I see as the original of history. He said to the British, well, listen, I'll come on to your side, I'll give you my financial resources, but you've got to guarantee me 5% of the Bengali trade rate from Cuba. So I said, okay, that sounds like a decent deal. But there were two contracts with Amachan. One was on white paper, and one was on red paper. And Amachan signed on red paper, went to the position 5%. White paper was the contract, and said on about this. After Passy was won, Amachan came back with his contracts, asked for his money, and Clive said, sorry, this is the right thing, nothing back. Now, actually, Amachan, believing in justice, took Clive and he put his court for failure to agree and finalise and deliver on the right, which I thought was a fantastic piece of upside down law. Anyway, this is conquest. So the company traded for many years, and I think this is looking at the company's history, for its first 100 years, 1600, 1750, it really was primarily a trader. But through the breakdown the beginnings of the World War with the French, it became sucked into the politics of subcontinent and became a prime actor in terms of politics, putting its own troops on the throne, the Japan, knocking them off again, and becoming the power behind the throne and draining India of its wealth. So that's how the company achieved conquest and control in India. Clive, right after the Battle of Passy, he wrote back to the board of directors in London here, saying this great revolution so happily brought about is complete in every respect. Now, great thing for the company is the company had to export silver bullion from London to pay for all the goods it wanted to win in from Bengal, particularly textiles. And so with the conquest available, it was able to stop that movement of silver. But its other main commodity that it was trading in was tea from China. And Chinese authorities were very, very strict about letting foreign traders into China, whereas in India it was much easier to create deals with the Mughal Empire or local princes to set up your own trading bases. In China, you could only actually trade through one town, canton, Guangzhou, and you could only stay in Guangzhou for 6 months a year. So the Chinese were super suspicious of what Europeans might do. And so how did the East India Company get access and actually manage to change the terms of trade in China? You couldn't do it through conquest. China was too big, too strong. But the thing that really changed the course of history was opium. Opium grown around Patna, in Bihar, to the west of Bengal. And here's the company's crest here. United East India Company. And after the conquest of Bengal, the company was able to run the opium growing as a monopoly. Peasants could only sell opium to the company, obviously being used for medicinal purposes. And then the company would sell that at its auctions in Calcutta, sell that to private traders in the 19th century, who would then be smuggled into China, bribing the local officials and so on. And the silver from that sale would be deposited in the company's base, we count on, and from that money, the tea would be bought. So essentially, the tea was becoming a substantial part of English life, was no longer bought with silver, but was bought essentially with the proceeds of the opium trade. And the company's shop, this its logo was known as Sign. That was, I suppose, the third part, distributed commerce, that's the picture, conquest, capacity, and then we had essentially contraband smuggling as the third leading characteristic of these. What got me into this was a sense of dislocation in history. I've worked a bit in Bangladesh, I've worked in the textile industry, looking at issues around labour standards and so on. And working with the Bangladesh Centre of Advanced Studies, we were looking at the trends in the textile industry. And the Bangladesh Centre of Advanced Studies wrote a fantastic report saying how Bengal has a glorious history of textiles until the East India Company came along. I'm a historian, and so I talked to these textile people who I was speaking to, said, what's this East India Company? And they said, well, this is the company that chopped off our William's thumbs. I said, nobody told me about this in England. So I came to work in the city. I went one day to East India House, where the site of East India House, which is there on the street here, where the Lloyd's working is, expecting to see a little plaque on the wall saying, here is the site of the East India Company, 1648, 1858. Now I will finish my sandwich and go away happily. The rest of the history. But there was nothing there, and that struck me as being odd. There's how in South Asia, in India, in Bangladesh, and in China, the Eastern companies isn't very much a part of history, nationalist history. And in some senses, people remember it too much. Whereas here in our society, up until a few years ago, it was very much an invisible part of history. So that's been essentially one of the reasons why I first wrote this book. As a company, it has sort of three big dimensions, and I think what I think is interesting, and I'd be interested to hear your comments, is that many of the issues around the company, issues which we still deal today with big business. The company has very many useful aspects. It managed to bring in huge amounts of rare from Asia, bring down the price of spices and textiles, tea, make these items of mass consumption, have huge lifestyle revolutions. But with it, had many of which we face today. First of these, it was a monopoly. It was granted a monopoly by the Crown. It was set up on the New Year's Day 1600 by Queen Elizabeth, which granted the monopoly of all trade between London and Asia. And this was done, one, because that managed to make a good profit. No one else could legally actually implement the information. But also, this was a very, very dangerous business. You had potentially hostile powers in Asia, you had storms, you had shipwrecks or pirates. So there had to be a sense of guaranteeing some return for the company. Now, as many of us who might study economics know, monopolies are not always very good for consumers. They enable companies to have high prices, that seems mostly the supply and demand. And one of the things is you get companies which are too big to play. And we'll go on later to discuss one example where a company actually needs to be bailed out. So that was one big characteristic of the company, was a monopoly. This was its sort of first major headquarters, were a quaint building on Leadenhall Street, and later basically replaced with much grander buildings. So that's the company and its first major characteristic. The second was actually a stock market listed company, it was a joint stock company. So it wasn't a family business, it wasn't a state business, it wasn't a partnership, but it was a joint stock company where you could buy and sell shares. Now, it was a very useful thing because it meant that actually you could draw in more capital from outside, you develop people's savings, you got merchants and so on and so forth. But you created this problem of continual tension between management and owners and the problems about speculation, which we see so much on stock markets. So this is the course of the company's share price from the 1690s on the left. A very, very high bubble up there. Up to very high prices. June 1720, that might be. That was a South Sea bubble. Nothing to do with East India. We just see what a slightly speculation you get, which brought the company share price as well. Straight down here. The second one here, March 1769, is what I call the Bengal bubble. So this is the result of the news coming back to London after the Battle of Nassau, after the company's increasing control of their more richest part of the this is what happened to the company share price. A very, very large, quite rapid rise, and then a crash. And then it took many, many years for the share price to return to the same levels of March 1769. In fact, a longer time than it took after the Great Depression in the 1930s. And then this is the final moment where the company share greed no more equals 1874, and the company is actually wound up in 1858. But as it was a primarily shareholder-driven company, it kept going for another 21 years since the last dividend was paid in 1854. So that's the second big characteristic. It was big. It was a monopoly, but also it was a share market company, and so it had all the benefits and some of the weaknesses that brings. And finally, it was governed by a board of directors. So this is, again, a picture of the boardroom in Leadenhall Street, where we meet each Wednesday. And it was governed by in a very sort of private sector way. So the Portuguese, when they sent their ships and their armadas to India, they established the Estado of India. This was a state-driven business. The Dutch, their Dutch East India Company was a mix, it was a hybrid, so private shareholders, but then the board was actually elected from all the big trading towns. Here you have board of directors elected by shareholders, just like we have today. And it acted like in a sense, an economic aristocracy. So you had to have a certain value of shares to be able to vote, and another, even more shares to be able to be elected. So actually, you have to be able to invest in aristocrat to get onto the board. And again, this structure had very many of the patterns we see today. The board was a site for contests between competing factions, particularly if you imagine when the share price was booming, people were asking for dividends and so on. This was around these seats would be a very, very favoured place to be, and there were lots of battles and indeed underhand trading. And the company, as I mentioned, had a charter. This was a 20-year charter in most cases, and it would be around these boardroom tables that actually the company would work out how you can continue to extend its charter, often leading to a lot of bribery and corruption down the road in Westminster. And so with these three big features, the monopoly, financing, and its governance, it built this empire of humans. So this shows some of the major trade routes the company had in the 18th century. So from London, from the docks very close to here, it would ship out largely silver bullion to India and set up major ports, starting with Drass, 1939, Bombay, which is a gift from Charles X wife. Calcutta, set up in the 1690s. And these would be companies, factories. These were company bases, and that we would do its trade. On the east there is Indonesia, but at least these are Spice Islands, the East Indies, and then obviously up to Canton, which is where the tea trade was done. Then commodities coming back to London, re-exported to Europe, crops in particular, re-exported to West Africa, and these were goods which would then be bartered for slaves. And then goods also re-exported across the Atlantic, again, textiles, but also tea. And as you can see, one of the ports in which the tea was sent was possible. So this was the company's empire of commerce. And I suppose what you can see linking that is three great river systems: the Thames, the Ganges, the Pearl River in China. Again, I think what is useful for us to recognise is that the East India Company, when it set up, had really no intention of going to India at all. This was the focus on the East Indies. These were the Spice Islands, and particularly was focused on getting access to pepper nutmeg and cinnamon and so on. So the focus here was for the East Indies, and the company first 50 years or so, 60, was focused on getting access to these islands, striking deals with the local princes, and exporting goods back. The company was pretty unsuccessful in this, partly because it was facing the Dutch East India Company, which was just that much more brutal than the British East India Company. And essentially, it sort of wound down its operations finally in the 1660s and exchanged its prized nutmeg island of Rum in these islands for a small island in the Americas known as Manhattan. Which was known at that time by the Dutch as New Amsterdam, and was quickly renamed as New York. So that was quite a good piece of real estate, I think. The next real sort of business the company went into was textiles, and obviously Indian textiles. This is not from Bengal, this is from Gujarat. Really, from the 1650s, Indian textiles started flowing into London and then being re-exported around Europe. As Prakash, an Indian historian, told me, through textiles, India civilized Europe. Because at that time, really, the cloth that Europe had was woolen, for most people, or linen. These were very, very heavy, quite dirty, smelly, difficult to wash. Cottons in particular, very light, easy to wash, beautiful printing, and so on. And through all the goods, many of the names we now associate with textiles came in from India. So you have the bandanas, the chintz, the calico, the dungarees, the ginghams, sisaka, and tapestry. And I think this was a very sensual revolution. These were very lovely things, beautiful things. And Daniel Defoe writes quite nicely how these textiles crept into our houses, crept into our closets, crept into our bedrooms. This was a sort of a huge lifestyle revolution. But it created a backlash. Many of the local peoples did not like the impact of the flood of these cheap, attractive Asian textiles. For the wool industry, they lobbied Parliament to try and get some support. And so in 1680, the government passed a law requiring people, when they were buried, to be buried in woolen shrouds as a way of stimulating the local wool industry. And as one way to put it, since the living would not bear it, they should, when dead, be forced to wear it. That was really enough to actually stop the tide of these fantastically attractive Indian textiles. So in 1697, in January, cold January, after the war, there'd been an economic slump. Lots of weavers in Spitalfields, quite near to here, they marched on Parliament. So about 5,000 weavers marched on Parliament. Eastern Parliament, no votes, nothing. But they marched on Parliament, knowing that that was the place where laws were set, and their goal was to achieve trade restrictions on Indian and Asian textiles. And on the way back, they came here. This was the East India Company House. So marched down from Spitalfields and marched down from the East End to Parliament on the way back and tried to break in through this door, the big hobnailed door, within which you have company's treasure, all the bullion that was used for buying textiles. Because this was seen as a company which was creating their hardship. Every ship came to London docks, would bring more textiles, and they felt to put them out of their jobs. If you read the accounts on the Old Bailey website, there's all these old cases, there are many cases of a fray and riot who were trying to break into East India House unsuccessfully in 1693. They didn't break into East India House, but they managed to get the law changed. And the law was changed, so increasingly there were restrictions, particularly on the import of printed calicos, taffetas, muslins is still being imported, unprinted cotton cloth, and they started a local business here in London of textile printing. So where William Morris has a printing press on the Water River in West London, that was one of these places where you take in the cloth and printed here. And this was a very successful piece of social economic lobbying. It was behind these trade barriers that, as the industrial inventions came along, the spinning jenny and so on, there was some sense of protection from essentially the major textile plants at the time in India. It looks like this. So this is Fort Weir in the background. This is the company's so-called factory. This is its base from where half its trade would come in the middle of the 18th century. Set up in 1690, and according to you, sir, there's now even a rock named after the person who set it up. Right. Yeah, so the person with Joe Chalmers, I learned today that there's a rock around the same area. Is it, where is it from? Chalmers?
The rock?
Yeah.
Not is widespread.
Widespread.
It's in South India.
Right. So this was the heart of the company. So it was the major subsidiary of the company, set up in 1690, and as one writer at the time was saying, Bengal was described as the sink where gold and silver disappears without at least expectation of return. So the company was shipping bullion, gold and silver bullion from London, had a few manufactured goods this time before the Industrial Revolution, and then used that to buy textiles to distribute back to Europe. The company's trade with the Empire was done through a series of trade treaties, which gave the company the ability to export its goods duty-free. So for many decades, this was a very, very healthy exchange. The company was bringing silver and bullion, they were stimulating local trade, it was good for weavers, they got more income, it was good, therefore, for the rural empire, stimulating the working with demand, and the exports went back to Europe. I only really reflected that how this changed. It was essentially through a process of tax evasion, because the company would be given these duty-free passes, these passes, and they started selling them to local traders, so they could also trade in a duty-free way. And of course, that was a way of evading taxes. So that's why the company had these very, very privileged terms. It always wanted to sort of go one stage further. So that was already started to road to the battle classes. The local Nawab prince, Suraj Dowlah, he was really complaining about this company's evasion of regulations, selling these duty-free passes. That was his first complaint. The second complaint was that the company was harbouring one of his political enemies in Fort William. Yeah. And then the third complaint is, well, why do you have a fort anyway? You're merchants. Why do you need a fort? Why do I have a fort and all these military apparatus? So he demanded that the company stop breaking the law, give him his political opponents, and then deal with Fort William. The company refused. Suraj Dowlah was captured Calcutta, and the result was a terrible one for the company. When the news hit the London markets, the company's share price slumped. This was about half the company's assets. This was the company's prized, sort of the jewel of its crown economically. And so it had to be recovered. And as we saw earlier, the person who did this was Robert. So we discussed earlier how Clive Wonder, there were some forces lined up, but essentially he managed to prearranged the deal with some very clever bribery in advance. He then marched on Murshidabad, the company's the Bengal capital, river, and then loaded the Bengal treasury onto boats and sent it down to Calcutta. Apparently, 100 boats were used to ship all the treasure, gold and silver down the river to Calcutta. And poor Amit Khan did not get his 5%. Now, in 1757 money, that represented about £2.5 million for the company and about £230,000 for Royal Clive in terms of the loot they were able to get. And today, in today's money, that was about £250 million and a success fee of about £20 million for Royal Clive. This made him, this victory made him known as the heaven-born general. He was seen as a fantastic victor. He re-established the country's position in Calcutta, its major base. No one really was concerned about how he did it. I think the Victorians later were a little bit concerned about his methods. And so he became the heaven-born general. And this was a key part in the overall British victory against the French in the 7 Years' War. So this was Clive's great high point. It was really only the starting point. His great masterstroke was this deal here, where you have the Mughal emperor sitting on a somewhat very elegant thing for an emperor, perhaps. But here you have the Mughal emperor Shah Alam granting the company through Robert Clive on his left the management of all taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This was the Diwan, the tax management services. So essentially, Shah Alam was handing over Her Majesty's revenue and customs to a combination of Exxon, Tesco, Walmart, BP, Unilever, just a huge, great corporate world. On the basis that this was a very, very efficient organisation who would be able to most efficiently raise and manage taxes and give him the tribute he needed to keep him in the lifestyle of gold finance. Now, Clive, this was fantastic. So the company gained control over all the taxes of the richest parts of the Mughal Empire. And he wrote back to the board here in London, saying basically that he made a 49% profit margin. He raised all the taxes, paid the administration, extended money off the Mughals, and he had 49% left just for the company. This was fantastic. And when the news hit London, the Gentleman's Magazine wrote this. The prodigious value of these new positions may open to this nation such a mine of wealth as to not only pay off the national debt, which we always like paying off, we always need to pay off the national debt, take off the land tax, ease the poor burdens and taxes, but add to the dividend as will astonish Europe. And if you remember that second spike in the share price, this deal was the deal which shocked the share price size. People came into the London market, bought the shares, knowing that they wanted to get a slice of this 49% profit margin. Clive was no slouch. So before he made the deal, he sent a note to his stockbroker here in London to buy as many companies' shares as possible, knowing that they were going to shoot upwards a little bit of insider trading, not the worst of its kind. This is a plaque from a couple of Douglas, which some of you might know, behind Liverpool Street, and it's one of the company's warehouses in the city. All around the city, the company had warehouses where it would store all the goods that they were bringing from Asia. And around the rim of this plaque, you can see some of the names of things which were stored in these warehouses. So spices, feathers, cottons, silks, and so on. And this comes from a poem written by John Mansell when he visited this warehouse in the early 20th century. It's quite a nice description. You showed me nutmegs and nutmeg husks, ostrich feathers and elephant tusks, hundreds of tons of costly tea packed in wood, singularly, and a myriad of drugs which disagree. Cinnamon, myrrh, and lace show. Golden paradise birds that glow. And a billion cloves in a odorous amount, and choice port wine from a glass of amount. You showed for a most delightful hour the wealth of the world and London's power. That's what he wrote after visiting the Covent Gardens in the 20th century. The Covent Gardens was set up in 1769, so 5 years after the War. Because what was happening now, essentially you have the unrequited trade. Some of them might have experienced that, the unrequited love, where we love someone and it's not returned to us. This was unrequited trade, so no longer was a silver cent from London to Bengal for the purchase of textiles and textiles coming back another way. Now you have these tax revenues, and you can use the tax revenues of Bengal to buy textiles for Bengal. And also you were now the monopoly player. This was unrequited trade. There was no two-way flow. This was no longer really exchange. This was a way of transferring tribute. And so you needed actually to build new warehouses to store the extra textiles you were shipping. And this was one of the buildings that was set out. But as we know, food often turned to bust. This is a picture of one of the famines in the 1870s. So this is not a historic picture of the terrible 1770 famine. But the company experienced a sort of huge 2-3-fold crisis in 1769-70. First, in the south of India, high rally from Mysore invaded the company's properties around again, that caused a slump in the company's share price. In Bengal, there was a drought in 1769, and this turned to a famine in 1770. Now, by my understanding, there was a fairly robust famine relief system in place historically, but the company was now in control. And these people, I wouldn't necessarily say were individually evil, but they were now in a system whereby their primary concern was the maintenance of tax revenues to pay profits for the company. So when the company heard about the famine and saw the famine intensifying, actually the tax revenues were put up. Because they wanted to the tax rates were put up, because they knew that they needed to maintain the same level of revenue. This was a terrible human disaster. At a time, millions of people died. Maybe now, we can say 1 million people died. And this was really largely due to the company's negligence and failure to respond to human suffering. Back here in London, Forrest Walpole, one of the writers at the time, wrote, "We have murdered, disposed, deposed, plundered, usurped. What think you of the famine in Bengal, of which 3 million perished, caused by monopoly of provisions by the servants of the East India Company?" So the company executive volunteered and very grain. All this is coming out unless that gold that inspired these horrors can wash it. So Walpole was saying 3 million died. Just at the time, the entire population of London was around less than 1 million. So this was a huge human catastrophe. And really had been engineered on the back of the coups, the drain of wealth, and so on. And finally, in 1772, you had a sort of financial slump back here in London. The share price fell. There was a credit crunch as banks came to the wall and couldn't pay out their debts. And the company had this huge unpayable debt and was forced to beg to the Bank of England for a loan, for £1 million loan. So you had this perfect storm of human catastrophe, financial disaster, and the company on its knees going to government asking for a bailout. So how did the party fall? You had this heaven-born general who had acquired Bengal for the company, but also part of the British Empire. And now on the right here, you have Robert Clive being seen now as Lord Watcher. He was the person who had actually set in train not only things which led to the human catastrophe, but also the financial catastrophe. Many MPs would have had shares in the East India Company, would have seen their share prices fall. So here we have in Robert climb right here, we're recoiling in horror at the procession of ghosts of Indian merchants who we ruined coming into a company's board meeting. How do we solve problems in Britain? Well, we set up a parliamentary committee. A parliamentary committee was set to analyse the company's affairs, and before this select committee, Clive came forward and had to account for himself. And in his sort of famous words, he shouted to the chairman and said, "My God, Mr. Chairman, at this moment I stand astonished at my own moderation." In other words, he couldn't take it seriously. There was a vote in the House of Commons to see whether the MPs agreed that I've been guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors, but actually the vote went in his favour. There seemed to be an offset. Yes, he may have done many illegal things. Yes, he may have got all these payments and wonderful payoffs after Barapasi, but on the other hand, the offset was indeed captured very well. But that didn't stop the march of reforms. There were three main reforms to the company. First, it got its bailout. We got £1 million from the government, just like banks a few years ago. But interestingly, the government took control over its dividends. Secondly, the government also took control over and appointed a new governor general. And Warren Hastings was appointed the first postal. And importantly, the government appointed 3 of 5 members of the Bengal Council, recognising that it was from Bengal, so many of the problems come, and the company's governance was wrong. And the third reform, which seemed to be the most innocuous, was the ability of the company to export tea from London. So traditionally, the company had sent out silver from London to buy tea from China, or increasingly using Indian silver to buy tea from China. That was shipped back, it was auctioned east in the house, and then small traders would sell it wherever they wanted to. Now the company was given the right to re-export its tea directly to one of its major markets, the Americas. And this is what happened in the tea market. So this was December 1773, the end of this huge crisis year for the company. The company now is shipping tea directly into the Americas. And the company was entering a point at which there's a fading dispute over the British government's rights to levy taxes on tea. No taxation without representation. And here you now have a monopoly company coming into the ports of the east coast of America, Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. And so not only do you have this opposition to the rights of the British government to levy tax, you have this new corporations, maybe driving a lot of the small businesses out of business. So a whole new political movement started, and pamphlets were circulating in all these East Coast towns. And one of them was particularly looking at companies' conduct in India, and wrote, "Forget their conduct in Asia for some years past has given simple proof how little they regard the laws of nations, the rights, the liberties, or lives of men. They are sacrificing millions for the sake of gain." So you know the results. 16th December 1773, you have Chinese tea with Indian money by a British company dumped in an American harbour in the middle of the sea where people dressed as Mediterraneans. This was a globalisation 18th century style. Sadly, he then went to Switzerland a few months later in Berkeley Square, where he lived. And Samuel Johnson said that he died in a sort of pang of conscience for the crimes he committed. I think it's pretty likely that Switzerland, he's buried in unmarked grave back in Shropshire. So, very sad. But the company was now really part of the sort of the key political struggles in Britain. It was a source of huge wealth, controlling Bengal, increasingly large parts of India. It was bringing this wealth back to London. And obviously, people wanted to get their hands on this. This is from 1784. I'm not sure it's the first time he used the metaphor of political football, but here we have on the left-hand side the Tory Prime Minister, William Pitt younger, and there's a big blackbeard, very fresh-faced. And then on the right here, you have Charlie Blackbeard, the Whig, Charles James Fox, who was quite disreputable. You can see his gambling dice, cards around his feet. And they played political football. What they played political football with? This is East India House. You might remember that quaint little building. This was the next one along. And they were battling down in Westminster who was going to control East India House, and thereby who was going to control all the money that was coming in from Bengal and India. So Charles James Fox and his ally Edmund Burke had proposed a law whereby the company would continue to exist, but you would eliminate its board of directors, so the shareholders would have no power in appointing the directors, and in its place you have parliamentary appointees. When one of the board of directors heard this, William Jones was set to die. Now, the bill passed through the Commons. Edmund Burke, a Dublin man, said, who would I make the East India Company accountable? Why it's Parliament to be sure. There's Dublin on the end of that, the voice on the end of that. So passed through the Commons said, yeah, we've got to sort out the East India Company, we've got to sort out the Southerners, can't let the board of directors control it anymore. But then when it came to the laws, that would hit problems. The Crown, City, the aristocracy, Canada. Charles James Fox's administration was kicked out. It was the general election. The Tories came to power. Some people said, on the back of East India money, bribing electors to pay for the seats. So we have Warren Hastings. He's the first governor general. He's the first person put into power to in Bengal to try and restore the situation. He, I think, for the company, is one of the most interesting people because he was obviously a very good person. He's one of these people where you have good people in bad situations doing wrong things. So on the right again, we have Charles James Fox. He never really seems to have good rating. You can see the rating. And then you have Warren Hastings, the company man, the shield of honor, all these treasures that he is bringing back from India, I think, from a camel, the lakhs of rupees, and here you have all these blissful figures trying to bring him down and take Charles James Fox, Edmund Burke, and so on. Hastings was a company man. He was a merchant. He was used to trading within India. He had risen through the company's ranks. And he clearly wanted to clean up the company's operations in Bengal. He was fluent in all the local languages. He sponsored the first English translation of the Bhagavad Gita. He set up a new madrasa for Muslim students in Calcutta, but also helped construct a Buddhist temple in Calcutta. So he was a very sort of man of the world and very sympathetic to Indian culture and religion. But he also monopolized the opium production. He was the first person to try and send and ship opium to China to make money. He hired out the company's armies to house. He kidnapped some of the royal family of the next door Principality of Goa. And he squeezed his even tighter spurs as he was involved. So here you have this very conflicted person. A very good person, individual, but doing a lot of really quite mad things. Thomas Corey summed it up quite nicely and said how he was receiving all these messages from the board of directors in London saying it was absolutely necessary for him to either disregard the moral discourses from the directors or the pecuniary requisitions. And so Hastings chose to neglect the servants and find the rupees. Hastings would be impeached by the House of Parliament. This is a procedure whereby the lower court has to vote through a series of charges, and then the upper court, the House of Lords, becomes the upper house, becomes the court and has to decide as a court on the validity of the charges. Edinburgh with Richard Brinsley Sheridan, playwright, by his side. He impeached Hastings for high crimes and misdemeanors. He declared, I impeach him in the name of the people of India, whose laws, rights, and liberties he has perverted, whose properties he has destroyed, and whose country he has made worse. So this was the British Parliament impeaching Warren Hastings. But like time before him, Hastings was deemed more offset by the good he was seen to have done by the company. The impeachment trial started in 1788 and went on for 7 years. And obviously, in the middle of those years, you had the French Revolution in 1789. And so the British government was much more concerned about defending itself against France than dealing with the ethical conduct of these people. So he was acquitted of all charges by a grateful House of Lords in 1785. Hastings was perhaps really the last real company man who had position power. And we're seeing a shift from companies as merchants really into a company driven by more geopolitical military interests. And on the left here, we have Richard Wellesley, who became Duke of Wellington. On the right, here we have Sultan, the terror of London Street, and what the Sultan I saw. And he was, I think, is seen by some Indian nationalists as being one of the few Indian rulers who had a chance to stand up to the company. He was modernising his state. He created alliances with France. He was known as Citoyen Tipu, and had banners, revolutionary flag up in West India. But he also was accused by the company in December. His capital is Pattern was overrun by the company. Wellington was known as the second general by Napoleon, in reference to the Indian troops in control and after the conquest of Pattern, Wellington led the uprising to suppress the rebellions across the Malabar coast. And writing to his officers, the Duke of Wellington, as he became, made clear that the more assertive villages you burn, the better. The people of Malabar will not be coaxed into submission. Terror, however, can induce you to give up their arms. This is the third incarnation of company in Level Street. Remember, we had a very quaint one at the beginning, with one which was being kicked around football. And here we have sort of the final incarnation of the Eastern, very grand building built in 1799, and it was here the company had its own museum where its athletes, artifacts, and its treasures from the East to be included, including Tipu's tiger, the man-eating organ that Tipu Sultan had established. The company was really now a shareholder-owned company with its share price moving up and down, but controlling the lives of tens of millions of people in India, with an army bigger than the British Army and a tax base almost as large. So the company was really, from the beginning of the 19th century, on a downward path. Its last commercial flourish was the construction of these docks very, very nearby, down the docks. You can see where the site of the Millennium Dome is there. And these were the docks built in 1807 from which the ships would head west to the East Indian Ocean. This was a really sort of technological marvel of the day. But only 7 years later, the company lost its monopoly with India in 1813, and in 1833 would lose its rights of trade with China. So increasingly, was being pulled back from being a commercial operation and was being essentially a licensed operator by the British state in India. Now you had the situation where you had free trade with India, you had increasingly industrial mill-made cloth flowing into India, no protection for the Indian textile weavers. So very soon after the it was 6 years, it'll be 6 years after the end of the company's development, the Dhaka company factory was closed down, so simply couldn't do any more business. So its commercial source was tea. Tea had been its major commodity since the middle of the 18th century. Now it was really the last piece of the company's commercial empire. And as I said, this was the nut the company could only really crack through. It was Warren Hastings who started the trend in the 1780s. And this really expanded in the early 19th century. The company well knew that the Chinese government banned the import of opium for obvious reasons. And when Warren Hastings tried this in the 1780s, it was severely reprimanded by the company because they thought of all consequences it would have for trade. But as I said, opium became very popular in China. It was smoked in China, which made it particularly addictive. The company's opium would be chips, tea bushes, and so on, and then replant them in Calcutta, Assam, and Darjeeling. And as one person has written, this is the greatest theft of trade secrets in the history of mankind. Now, when I started looking at this, I thought that the opium wars was when the Royal Navy came in to try to suppress the drug trade, because I thought it was the same sort of time as the suppression of slave trade. And I thought the Royal Navy coming in to suppress the opium trade. None of the sort. So when Chinese authorities actually tried to stop the opium trade, they seized the opium, they destroyed it. Free traders like lobbying governments, sending the Royal Navy to recapture their position. First open war, the company in China was forced to cede Hong Kong to Britain and open up 5 ports. And in 1860, the second open war, ending with the sacking of Beijing and the freeing of opium to be sold and consumed without any restrictions in China. But by 1860, the company itself was no more. So opium was still bearing the company's chest, but by 1860, the company itself had gone into the dusty history. And as many of you know, this came through what was known as the Indian Mutiny, Great Rebellion, the First War of Independence. The company really had become increasingly separated from the local people in India, all the way to the 18th century, good exchange of people, the company relying on local merchants or intermarriage and so on. 19th century, that narrowed, and the company's settlers, its soldiers, rose up in rebellion in 1857. Huge concerns that there would be forced conversion of the Hindus and Muslims into Christianity. And so this was a large rebellion against the company. It was a very brutal conflict with sort of massacres on both sides. And here we have a Punch magazine from August 1957 describing and showing some backlash from London against the company's incompetency. Here is the execution of John Company, the nickname of the company, blowing up there ought to be in Liverpool Street. And you probably can see that the classical facade of the company's headquarters in the middle. And here are all the crimes of the company's incompetence. So it's nepotism, it's laundering, it's avarice, it's government, and it's supineness. The rebellion was put down, and the Mughal Empire came to an end. This sort of blowing up describes a rather nasty practice which was used in India, where you strapped the prisoners to the end of your hands and blew them apart. To encourage the others. The company was really now heading for the scrap yard, and these 2 severe Victorian gentlemen were involved in the last stages of its days. On the left, you have John Stuart who was much more fun than his picture suggests. He had worked at the East India Company for 35 years. He was known as an economist, and after his retirement from the company in 1858, he became known as a champion of liberty and women's rights. There was also something with character work, and one account describes how, when he was particularly inspired, he used it before sitting down to his desk to strip himself of his coat and waistcoat, but also of his trousers, and so set to work, alternately striding up and down the room and lighting at great speed. And as you can see in this picture, we can't quite tell those trousers. The other side, you might know, is Karl Marx. Now, these two strange people, they were friends. They knew each other, both lived in London. They were both political economists. They both wrote about big economic issues at the time. And Karl Marx at this time was a journalist for the New York Tribune, and he was a much better journalist than politician in history of life. But he wrote a lot about the end of the East India Company. He wrote nicely when the company was bound up by arms, that the doom of the East India Company appears to be sealed. They did not die like heroes, it must be confessed, but they have vastly delayed their powers, they crept into it, bit by bit, in a business like wealth. So John Stuart Mill was sent by the company from Leadenhall Street down to Westminster, trying to stay this execution to stop the Crown taking over the East India Company, bringing it into their hands. He pleaded with the MPs and said how the company, at their own expense, while they each their own powers, acquired for the country the magnificent empire in the East. The MPs had none of this, the India Bill was passed, the company was wound up. But as Marx suggested, the company was mostly concerned about its dividends, which would be paid for another 20 years. And so the company's sort of era came to an end, and the British Raj began. One of the things I found when I was sort of walking around London trying to understand its history, I was constantly puzzled by this statue here, the statue of Clive, which many of you might know. On the left is the Foreign Office. And this statue was put up in 1911. So a long time after Clive had died. He died in 1784. He was a young man. He was a very perplexing man for Victoria. Clearly, from an imperial perspective, he had done great things. He had conquered Gaul and so on. But he'd done these in very, very underhand ways, briberies, corruption, trading, etc. So for many years, he was a perplexing person. It was only under Lord Curzon, as an imperial promoter in the early part of the 20th century, this statue was put up. The Foreign Secretary at the time, Secretary of State for India at the time, was a liberal, called John Morley. He tried to resist this statue being put up because he thought that Clive raised so many problems that he really wasn't someone who should have a statue. And wasn't statue of Garibaldi instead, the Italian nationalist. But Curzon got the money, and the statue was put up. And so the company really is sort of, you could think it's now just a sort of a historical thing, you've got these statues around and so on, but it continues. It continues in many interesting ways. So here you have the Indian TP advert, where you have this Indian tycoon driving around the streets of a port city, seeing a huge building with East India Company written on it. And he tells his driver to stop the car, saying, "They ruled us for 200 years, and now it's our turn. I want to buy that building." Now, the strange thing is that actually there is an Indian who has bought these Indian companies. So there's a man called Sanjeev Mehta who went to the British government and said, "I want to buy the rights to the East India Company name," a few years ago, and he set up this new East India Company, which sells very, very high-priced luxury goods and teas. So if you want a hamper for your family for Christmas, £1,000 to spare, go down to Regent Street and buy a hamper of the company teas and drinks. So the company has remained in our culture. We now have a museum, National Maritime Museum, as a permanent collection. And so I think the company remains very much part of our culture. Many good things, bringing trade and prosperity, but as I would suggest, there are also many issues about power and science, and so on. Thank you for staying with me, and happy to have questions if that's been with you. It's easy. All the paintings I showed you are sort of contemporary, that's right. Yeah, from the time. Yeah. Which ones are the original? Okay. Yeah.
It's Bangalore.
Yeah.
That Bangladesh.
Bengal is divided into two as independent. So you have West Bengal, which is in India, and you have East Bengal, which is in Bangladesh.
What's the estimate of the total value of the company in these schools?
I haven't seen one. Maybe I should try and work one out. Yeah. I mean, I think that, well, yeah, I haven't seen a relevant one. No. Have you seen one? No.
No.
I haven't seen one. No. I mean, you could probably add up, if you had the time, and add up the value that was dividends, it's very certain. I mean, there are a number of questions about the value of dividends, private wealth, gains,
Obviously, that well,
right.
so where did it go to the size of its building mansions? So, impact on economy was here.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I mean, I think back in the book I go into this, but I mean, at the time, this was, I mean, 1757, this was before the Industrial Revolution. So you had a relatively poor, very poor society, which hardly grew at all. So there's no growth, very little capital. Yeah. And so from India, most of the West Indies, didn't actually need much capital to have an impact. So as you say, this would come into the economy, would go into build big mansions and so forth. But there are people who say that it's a very controversial point that it was West Indies and East Indies wealth providing the capital for the Industrial Revolution. It seems to be likely to have an impact. Yeah, because you have a slow growing society, very little capital, and then it's extra capital. It's very controversial. So,
Yeah, when you read British Indian history, there is the East India Company period and the beginning of the British Raj. Yeah, the way you describe the overlapping of the East India Company's economic interest with the sort of ruling class interest. Right. You know, most of the MPs have been shares and making decisions how the government should be run, also dominating the company. So in that sense, the East India Company is a facade. The British ruling class was directly involved in, if you like, Indian affairs, using this facade of East India Company as a way of doing it.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, in some sense, I suppose if you were wealthy, you were likely to have shares in East India Company. So that was one thing. But I think there was a period, let's say, a period of about 50, 60, 70 years where it wasn't a start. So the Parliament and so on had to have increasing control of the company because it was seen to be something which was out of control. And so you have the start on the company still nominally controlling things, nominally still trading, or nominally actually in charge of India. But behind it, you would have the British state rule of script. So I think from 1770s onwards, that's more clear, that's right.
Yeah, so I'll just make a few points. 300 years later, nothing has changed. The back of classy illustrates, like the point over there, the sport of the ruling elite to penetrate into other countries. There they went under the name of the trade. Today, they want to destroy the world in the name of democracy. Today, anybody who stands in their way, and wherever the natural resources are, they go with a regime change and say, oh, we are able to restore democracy. While their record illustrates that wherever in the world they went, they destroyed what was even a bit of democracy. That's the first point I will make. And the second is, the last victory you showed, where the Indian elite, the Indian corporations, taken over the East India Company, some people must say, what do you say? I would say, they used to make India. Today, India has been taken over by the corporations. The last election we had, where Mr. Modi came to power, he is a representative of the Indian elite, Indian corporations. India is ruled by the corporations through the so-called parliamentary democracy. Indian natural resources, like in the years ago, in the eastern belt of India, are today again under attack. Again, people are fighting for Jal Jungle and Jameen, while the corporations, with the help of the Indian government, want to destroy their livelihood, destroy their habitat, and take off the bauxite, iron ore, whatever it may be. And what the Indian government get? Indian corporations get 95% of the total loot, and the Indian government get 5%. And the last point was made is it is in the name of democracy. They want India to progress. When they say they want India to progress, it's a complete fallacy. Nothing has been progress in the operation. They don't want the Indian people to grow. They want Indian cooperation.
One question. Is
Yeah. Right.
with only 1.9% of the land.
Yeah.
Question that comes to mind is, that was the case. Why the industrial revolution did not happen?
I think Mohammed just kept capturing another session. Why the Industrial Revolution didn't come to India? I think we need another opportunity. But no, I think the figures you quote are, I mean, this is what I the story of the East Indian Company is a very extraordinary story. Because you have very small country from a very, very poor country in the northwest of Europe, with very few people, over many decades, starting to control large parts of what was there. Well, yeah. And how did they do that? I mean, it's extraordinary because it wasn't forced violence. The company's soldiers were Indians. It wasn't really through wealth, because the company needed to borrow from Indians, yeah, from people like them in China. So there was an extraordinary story where I was one through, I think, organisation. And I think that was probably the company's biggest advantage. It was a structured organisation. Yeah? It had all the systems and so on. It wasn't personality-driven politics. A lot of ruling families in India were, with the technical skill. It's extraordinary story. One more slide.
I'm proud of the East Indian Company. I mean, the way you talk about it, it's crazy to me. Like, if you can just be talking about it as has good things, that it's about trade and prosperity. And what the hell?
Well, I mean, I think again the bits which I was talking about are the gory bits, then one the interesting bits. But I think there's a piece of the company's history which is, let's say, the first 100 or so years, 150 years, let's say, where it did what we need companies to do, which is trade, keep quiet, largely keep out of politics, and focus on doing things like bringing goods to different parts of the world. Yeah? The real problem was how they convinced politics for destroying the regulations which control it, and democracy tried to, through Parliament, try to control it and failed. So I'm not proud. But I think you could see in this example what happens when economic institutions are not break that.
Just make another point. I said, where to say that it's the ruling class from Britain, like that it's in the south and the ruling class from Britain, and you're saying it's a statement. I mean, I think it's the whole of the European way of thinking that is behind it, that makes it, that allows for this to happen. You know, that you're making it into a couple of individuals that, yeah, are corrupt and they're horrible sometimes to people. They don't keep their words, and that, as if it's a corrupt company that does some good and some bad, but it has to bring forward. And that's the world as we know right now.
No, it's just very systemic, and I think, I mean, you can tell stories through characters, but that's why I find characters like Warren Hastings interesting, because I think it shows people a situation, systemic situation where like you must be personally very ethical, do very bad things. So it is a system. Yeah.
Do you think it would be the West Coast owe something to Europe or India?
Right.
And so it's the national memorial thing, like the mass movement that took place and the after politics and dialogue that they get instead of time.
Well, I think it's a very, I mean, I don't suggest that in the book. I mean, coming in and you saw it, there was a sign on the wall for Queen Mary saying reparations conference. So I didn't know whether this was actually going to be the same thing. It's organised by the local Rastafarians, so I think
I'm saying Bangladesh procedure goes really important.
Yeah.
But the reality what I wanted to see here is that it was one of the most sort of state. So I think the perception that you have of what was told before. Well, I appreciate the fact that he came back and kind of sort of telling us a story.
Right.
I think that needs to be.
Right. Well, I mean,
take further.
yeah. I mean, I don't know whether I haven't seen any campaigns for reparations or whatever. I mean, I think that's mostly in the context of slavery, where it's very organised.
Yeah, that history, sort of, monument. Maybe there's only five, I think that's doing very good history.
Yep.
And I think that's sort of been sort of fair to the whole history. I mean, when you first started off with Paul, then it went on we took the money on the course by saying.
What do you see?
But that's about state trade.
Yeah, it's yeah. Well, they share the same one first. Yeah. So it's fine.
I mean, if you know about the expectation in your I feel like it seems to me something I've just very recently become aware of is the whole standard of the African trade, which the EIC is so deeply involved in. Oddly enough, I was just talking about Alexander Gosh's pockets before the talk. Which did that very much. And I hadn't realised there were so many links between Myanmar and China because international issues going to and fro. From the Bengali side, as well as the EIC side. And it seems to me that when we're talking about how the East India Company, also we talked about 30, 40 years ago, the only side of the trade isn't really talked about. It's something that, I'm studying the EIC during this before, and we haven't touched it at all.
Right.
It's still happening.
I mean, I think that's, again, I suppose what, as a person from London, what really interests me about this story is particularly how close to the surface this story is from people from South Asia and from China, and how little consciousness that I think there is of people bringing up that, the consequences of what their corporations do. There's almost nothing. So when you had exhibitions, I think, at the Live Indian Company, it was sort of depicted as this sort of glorious, swashbuckling, entrepreneurial people who were battling against pirates with all these spices. Didn't mention anything about opium, conquest.
It's really question about the irons of the sort of fiction. In that he has to be kind of justifying and saying, well, if God didn't want opium to go to China, he didn't intend opium to China, this is a trend. again, I've seen this is probably like socialising and all that. I'm not really good on dates with the opening day, but on one hand, you've got this consciousness that you've got this, duty to India, or to our subjects, whatever, apparently in the 70s, 70s.
Yeah.
And it's the other side, you've got people, sending in Harvey to protect the opium trade in China.
Well, the open trade was later. 1820s.
So this you have that painting up in that or that painting
Which one?
the painting of well it's the Bengali or the subjects for giving out the riches to so this would be considered legal to have that.
This one.
Yeah.
That one's in the foreign office.
Is that to have that?
That's what we have to do. I think this is. That's why. I
Was literally a progress that.
I suggested that statute should be taken down and the rest of the issue. I think we should interrogate these things. This is our culture.
We need to do
That is deviating. You talked earlier about weavers who marched against the incoming Indian province, but the law was passed. But they accepted Muslim.
That's right.
And what do you think actually a Muslim could be said officially dead? But what do you think led to the final days of Britain's trade with Muslim? Why did it find, despite it being so much, how did it die with trade?
Well, Muslim was instituted in the 1720s. There was no substitute for it. So you have, this is 1778, you've got Britannia and elements of that there. But then, through the 18th century, you were able to produce industrial mill-made Muslim. Yeah. And so actually, that's what was structured. Actually, the Industrial Revolution grew, you had the quality of production in the grass. And so when the company's monopoly ended for trade in 1813, that's when you had the flood of industrial crops coming into India. And the local textile industry and being hit very well. And that would have included Muslim at the time.
Because it's doing some research on Muslims, we were saying that part of the reason why Muslims could have died was that in the UK and the Western world it was only worn by the very rich.
Right.
So when they decided this, when it's no longer fashionable.
Yeah, that's not true as well. Yeah.
Great, well.
So fashion is
Actually, there were cheaper versions of Muslims as well.
right.
Yes. But just to comment, I mean, this is simply so questions. I'm left with the feeling as if book shows in the company, like, on the one hand, and on the other hand. I think that's the general view rather than separate. Yeah, in terms of saying that in the one hand, these about the people in the other hand, the structure has all along been agreed. The structure has all along been controlled. The structure means the self-interest. And it shows feelings of Parliament actually worried about the people, but Parliament worried about the company, worried about the dividends and the returns, and what impact it had upon its other operations around the world. Okay. And that's it. And those are the days of what we call the life. We is not we speak in terms of meeting. And so, if I were to and the company that stole from the world, changed the world. So, I mean, this is where I think that I was whitewashed, but there's a degree of generosity that creeps in.
Right.
Okay. And it's our fault as much as anybody else's.
I mean, I've been risked by a lot of people in India, guys, and we sort of kind of going up to the other side. So, really done some crystal. So, anyway.
It should be the first company, not the company, and they're all still doing it, right?
Yeah.
First
Absolutely. First off, it's the workers.
It's not on the one hand and the other.
What extent the company managed to exploit the religious differences? What you think is kind of a mind.
Right.
Iran had 50,000 soldiers, and Clive only had 3,000. He managed to travel from Calcutta to Murshidabad without any opposition. Nabob was a Hindu merchant. He helped God.
That's right.
Many, it is now coming to the trend that many Hindu lands actually took the side of these people.
Right.
So if you know a little bit more than I'm interested to find this out.
It's a dimension I haven't looked at so much. Later on, British was certainly very focused on dividing and settling communities against each other. In many cases, two communities didn't need any encouragement. So I think I haven't seen that as being a major theme in history.
I just point out one thing. In the Battle of Plassey, if I remember correctly, there were like 5 main generals, on the Sheldon side. It was Yar Latif Khan, Raidullah, Mir Jafar, Mohanlal, and Mir Madan. The 3 generals betrayed, Yar Latif Khan, Raidullah, and Mir Jafar. The 2 that remained, they were Mohanlal and Mir Madan. They were both Hindus. So they were loyal to the Muslim ruler. So,
It's come to the picture now. Many colonization, you find now that many landlords actually support each other with the Muslim landlords.
But Mir Jafar was one, so I think
He is a symbol of Muslim.
yeah. So I don't think the religious aspect.
I think there was a little bit there, which the British did try to exploit, and there was a little bit there, but that became more, important and later on.
Yeah.
Then could you explain any kind of correlation between the trade of the immigration in the 1970s?
Not sure, really, no. The company was a trading company. There were some people who had come through the company's operations, the sailors, the lifeguards, and so on. The company wasn't really a major force for immigration.
Yeah.
Just open the table on at the moment, and I'm just thinking, when you Hong Kong belonged to China, was given to the British, basically because they wanted they wanted to carry on exporting their opium to China. China lost that war. It is now sort of assumed that Hong Kong was the victim of huge human rights abuses because it's owned by China. I never heard what I could mention. This is the first time I actually realised that.
Yeah. It's I went to Guangzhou and to look at find out more about Guangzhou.
Right.
And there is a large opium museum. Yeah. Many people know sort of the Chinese realist art. So you have all these very strong Chinese peasants and soldiers crushing boxes of East India Company opium fibers in the forecourt of this.
And he was saying, because the Yankees played on Hong Kong. So obviously there's a great consciousness.
Right.
I don't know, I've not never been in Bangladesh, but I think you will be far anyway. But it just seems bizarre. We're always talking about Hong Kong and China. The actual historical transfer, I've just never seen discussed.
That's the basis.
It's just interesting, what gets discussed and what doesn't.
And in Chinese history, the first Opium War to 1949, where the control is known as the 100 Years of National Unification. So the Chinese culture and living wars are absolutely central across 100 years of national humiliation. That's the phrase.
So, is there a theory that says that the destruction caused by the King stopped with the Commonwealth stopped with
Well, that's the official. Yeah.
It's interesting to hear the views of religion and business.
Right.
Right. We see a lot of that in Indian subcontinent. Corrupt politicians, business people, gifting the world with mosques and madrasas. This is the accompanying version. Use the same tactics. And then they even, I think, somewhere in popular, the church, the East India Company gets you to be the poor working classes in this camp.
So is this chap?
Yeah, chap. That's right.
If you want to find out more, talk to Sister Christina.
Legacy, I think, talking about legacy of these Indian companies, they're still very much alive in the Indian subcontinent politics.
I think there are two parts to that story. I mean, I think in the first days of the company, when we simply focused on money, and they saw religion as a very disruptive force. And so there was a law that actually every ship going into Asia needed to have a priest on board if it was over 700 tons. And it was remarkable how many ships, 699 tons. Boy, they saw religion as a disruptive force. You need tensions. So that's the first bit. But as the company actually ceased being a pure trading organization, and as we had more parliamentary interference and so on, there was more public debate about it. So when you had the removal of this trading house in India in 2013, at that time there was huge petitions all around the country for the company to be given powers or duty to promote Christianity. Yeah? So at that time, in a Christian country in the 19th century, if you had a corporation, the general view of people like the workforce was that its company's corporate business would be to promote Christianity. And I think you can see a sort of clear link eventually to the reason that actually there was never an ambition to really convert, but there was in fears that would happen.
Any questions?
What's the main between the two books, the first and the second?
Okay. Okay. So I added let's go new chapter on Indian and more on South India, actually. Yeah, that's the history change.
You found it. I read it.
There are other companies operating in the area.
That's right.
French,
English.
and English. When and ultimately,
Yeah, that's right.
trade and war.
Yeah.
But the difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think the East Indian Company, the English East Indian Company was much more of a sort of private sector. Still, I would say it's an private army. The other companies were more state-backed. The Dutch were so you have private capital, government.
But in the tactics,
Not really.
When they did trading, they first back to use money, but they still taking profits to
Well, they were all seeking the same thing, which was you have relatively rural European countries trying to have access to more sophisticated luxury goods that they should get in right. And the company came out on top, the English company came out on top in the 18th century, but it was actually one of those still startup. Much more powerful, much more brutal in the early stages.
What's the battle between England and the country? The battle, they battle?
There was a 7 years war between Britain and France, which India
We want some, or this thing. No, written. Oh, written.
Lots of that. Lots of them.
And there's one question here.
Yeah, you mentioned 4 Cs, right? So,
Yeah.
I'd like to suggest that one of those 4 Cs are actually the 5th C, which is colonialism.
Yeah.
And colonialism writ large, not in the sense of a particular boots on the ground, ships in the sea type model, but in terms of a legacy structure which is much bigger than just economics and politics, right? Also has to do with frameworks for thinking, knowledge, broadly referred to as epistemology.
Right.
And that's ongoing. I mean, I would argue that it's still in a colonial world,
Right.
but not maybe in a colonialist world, possibly. And on that basis, I want to suggest that I think one of the comments you made earlier was that there's a kind of debate about whether or not what happened in the Eastern East and what happened in the Western. So if you like the textiles trade and then the slave trade,
Yeah.
whether that actually provides the determinant factor for bootstrapping the Industrial Revolution. The contemporary so-called capitalist world of order, which for me, capitalism is just a component of much bigger. I want to suggest the reason that debate goes on is because if it was settled, that would legitimize the call for reparations. And so I think it's in the interest of academics who are situated within what could be described as a colonial matrix of power to maintain that debate. Otherwise, you get a green light to reparations.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with you. I think if you look at the national origins of the people on both sides of the place, I mean, you have essentially people in the West taking one side and people in Asia taking the other side. Yeah? And these battles are fought out all the time. When the permanent gallery at Maritime Museum was being set up about East India Company, I think the curators would have wanted to have all about commodities and ships. Yeah? And through the outreach stuff, we managed to at least get some of the other side, the human impact, the social impact, the conquest, the destruction involved. So it's halfway. That other side is there. But that's a dominant narrative. It's still very, very helpful. That's trying to be my mission is actually to reveal this story, particularly in Britain and Europe. And I think it's a more compelling story because it's about corporations. Yeah? Because I think that sometimes when people talk about colonialism, they think of them as these are structures led by states, empires. Yeah? Whereas we know that the British Empire in India was actually founded by a corporation run by a shareholder of the company based in London, Australia.
But just and that's why I specifically framed it in terms of colonialism rather than imperialism. Rather than framing it in terms of states and markets, to try to, sometimes there's a tendency to, the very language used to frame the issue ends up scuppering any attempt to actually effecting a resolution that might bring about some kind of restitution.
Right.
So I'm using colonialism in a very broad, encompassing sense. And just on the point of why issues like the opium trade isn't on the agenda, it's not part of kind of mainstream currency in terms of sharing knowledge. I want to suggest that this is something to do with what can only be described as white ignorance. And this is the term I come up with. Just let me unpack this a little bit more. This is to do with who dominates the discourse, whose voice gets to be heard, whose voice carries weight. And it may be that at specific periods, certain narratives can be aired because it serves to maintain, expand, and refine power. But other times, particularly in this so-called post-racial era, that it becomes possible to have other discourses aired. So we can have events like this where we can talk about this. Because to some extent, we're in post-racial spaces. Everyone can talk equally. I mean, we're all aware to some extent that that's not true. But then we've fed a constant discourse that we're in a post-racial era, so maybe it is true. In terms of non-white people not knowing about this, I think that just reflects the extent to which coloniality, as opposed to colonialism, remains intact The very structures of knowledge that we reproduce are largely those of the.
Absolutely, I'm trying to go, I think a lot of time, and this is a little bit like a lecture. I find this whole kind of violence, and I think what you're trying to do, what I think you're trying to do, talking about, structures of power, is interesting. But this talk of colonialism and violence that seems to imply, there are colonialists in India who are Indian, and there are anti-colonialist people in the post-racial world in England who are white. And I think if you start, you need to start making autonomy. What might have been some kind of colonialism, hegemonic thinking, so I don't know about their period. I mean, also, yeah, well, I just think it's very clear. It's a particular academic discourse that's heavy. And I think it's very patronising. Thank you.
And so he said, "What? You have some water languages. That's the whole point of the struggle, that you try to resist the dominant narrative. That is.
I think this whole thing of violence is very very polarising. I think it does.
Well, that's what power does, it polarizes.
Yes, but power appears in different forms in different countries, and it can be the same, although different people are exercising it. And once you start talking about colonialism as one of the violence, it's as though, the once colonised countries somehow have some of that power structure in the other violence.
So what should we do? What should we do? Should we do anything about it?
Well, we should first put a patent on the floor like this. We could do more of one we have access to do a couple of history on something.
Right. Yeah, because I'm interested in intervention of the state as to try and change.
Yeah, we try to get rid of the monuments from London. London will be empty.
Exactly. All those popular contest, actually saying that outside foreigners we have Robert Wright, which I don't think is the best representation of Britain's relations with the rest of the world.
You can tell the story.
Well, it's depending on which bit you're living in.
You can tell the stories like, I mean, it's very old-fashioned with our kids and all the kind of well-known. If people don't know this, I just know very much about the African from today. I certainly know Hong Kong came over to this as well. If you tell people, if you give people knowledge, that gives them the power to make their own decisions, to change their opinions.
We have a big struggle on our hands because just looking at the recent attempt to put up a statue of an Asian Muslim woman who was fighting for the British troops in the Second World War, just to put a little statue of her up into a small English garden it was like you could shed blood, not tears. But they got their institutional position to her and her etc. So if you're talking about bigger stages, it really help because the opposition to expose something as the truth of our contribution to this society is
the very thing you need to do, isn't it? Rather than going into the community of truths for academic discourses about colonialism and violence, is to get to the basics that you know. There was a city called Chile on the British culture.
I don't think the story needs to be told.
Yeah, exactly. You need to go back to a very basic empirical level. But somehow the story has really moved away from modern history. I'm about to give you
So I'm interested in things we can do to try and bring perspectives to bear in our public history, because public history of London, or you walk around the streets of London, none of this is represented. And if it is represented, it's represented as global.
Popularising would be a really good way.
Yeah, I think one thing that could be done, especially if you think that academia unfortunately is still pulling the, pulling the debate in this hegemonic way in which the stories are told, is that, for example, you could rethink the title of your book. Maybe instead of talking about colonizers as good people, think about the colonized.
Do you think I said that?
No. No, no, you said no, but there was one person who said he was a good man, although he did also good work, right? And for example,
Which is often the case.
yeah, sure, people are, yeah, I know, but then there's, what is not been told about the nice, like, when they do people, what about their studies, like, so maybe because you put the question out there, like, what can we do? What would you,
I've already done something. I've written a book.
yeah.
So I feel as you, and I'm trying to inspire people to do good things. I'm always doing stuff in my book. You can read it and see what's in there. And the processes that go to St. Thomas Community Centre in Bolton. So I've done my thing.
That was the East India Company Church.
Yeah, the community centre. That one.
Nick, I think we need to.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Mark. Thanks.
Wait, are we done? Like, I don't, I think we should think about what, you say, I've read the book and money is valuable for
Yeah.
great, I'm sure it doesn't, but I'm missing a connection between, like, I'm not getting out my words correctly, because I'm really upset by a couple of things that you said, like the word red Indians, I don't know where you think use that word, for example, like a few things really should be over. Anyway, isolating the East India Company is from the rest of the country, what Europe is, Europe supremacy or white supremacy has come from this. Right. We need to see a connection between the company there and some good or bad, good and bad individuals or something that did something. To the region that we have right now, to the ability to go to schools, to everything that we're facing. And I think only by talking about colonialism and coloniality, we can understand it. We can go as deep as this, because if we just look at some separate traders or some people, we're missing out on all the different ways how coloniality has affected our minds. And I'm sorry to say, it's still a white Irish man that's talking about this. It's still completely run by Europe, by Europeans, like those are the ones who are still defining knowledge and picking up the theories. How much is it changing? It's only changing if the rest of the non-European world is following all of the way how knowledge is being produced from Europe, like only then. It's like when we begin to talk academics.
That's why there was a lot of academics studying up there. That their parents don't encourage them to go to academia and 50,000 a year, whatever it is. They want them to go to banking and accountancy and medicine. Which, we have to get
Decolonizing the mind, decolonizing economics, music, food, everything. And you see it in South America and North America, here in Europe, there's network where there's a group called the Coloniality London. And that's trying to address all of the points, realize how much are we really colonized, how colonization affecting the way we love, the way we talk to people, the way we dress, all of that. It's really, well, yeah. It's really getting
I think everybody's right. Yes, thank you very much. Well, can I just say a few things about you all got this work? Yeah. This was my project there, and I got a few more in my bag. Our next program. Hello. Excuse me. Our next program is on Monday at the IDS in Mexico. And it's called The History, Theory, and Practice Contemporary Trends in Scholarship on Bengal and its Implication for Academia more broadly. Contribute. That's Monday, the IDS store. This is by Don Steele, Dr. Steele. Sorry. Right? Do take this one more information. When we did the project with the young people, when they looked at the ASEAN and the sector of plastic, blah, blah, we learned something, and then out of that, another project where we looked at Bengal textiles. And we did a project of how villages and towns in Bengal just landscaped in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. There's a video on YouTube. If you type how villages and towns in Bengal just landscaped, I don't have many, I've got a few books, on a few book copies. Whoever did it,
Perhaps you can't manage and just give the definition.